Hello! Welcome to another episode of That's So Bizarre! I'm your host, author, hippie, gypsy pirate, Becky Porchot. We're here today at Change Jar Books, and I'm doing an interview with Armand Rosamilia. Did I say it right?
Yes.
All right.
Nice to meet you too. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure.
All right, so we are here because Armand, not only does he write scary things, he's also experienced some scary things. So, tell me about this haunted house that you lived in.
From New Jersey originally, and I wrote a book called Keyport Cthulhu, and it's set in the town of Keyport in New Jersey, which is a real town, and it's a real old, spooky town.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the stuff in the book is actually weird stuff that has actually happened in town or happened to me. Not the Cthulhu part. That's
Right.
a whole different thing.
Uh-huh.
But I lived in a house that was about 150 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and it used to be it's right in the center of town, and it used to be basically the funeral parlor
Okay.
for basically Keyport and the entire area.
So it was the place where people would go for their funerals.
Right.
Okay.
And what was cool is the house was huge. It was a
Right.
2-story, and I rented the bottom story and the basement.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like 5 rooms adjoining with the sliding doors and the big bay windows, which
Mhm.
were all the viewing rooms.
Right.
So
right.
like the furthest viewing room was my room. Was
Okay.
my bedroom, which was cool. And it
Okay.
had this big cherub relief on the ceiling, everything like high ceilings, plaster everywhere.
Yeah.
It was really cool, and it had like this huge fireplace that wasn't in use that had been brass had sealed it off, and there was like this weird. I always looked like it was like a demon, this figurine. It was like
Nice.
spooky, and I was managing bands. It was back in the mid '90s,
Uh-huh.
and the guitar player, his family owned the house, and
Okay.
they rented it out.
Okay.
So they gave me a really good deal because it was this huge house. I couldn't afford it
Right.
any other way. But so when I first moved in, like basically the first day I moved in, the neighbor across the street, who was like this nosy neighbor, came over and she said, "Oh, we called the cops like about a month ago on this place." And I said, "Why?" Turns out no one had lived in the house for about 3 years. They had bought the property because it was
Right.
a huge piece of property. And about a couple months before, they heard all this noise. It sounded like big band music playing.
Wow.
So she said her and her husband, and they both said it,
Yeah.
they look out the window and the shades are all down,
Right.
but they can see lights and people. It looked like there was like 100 people inside, and they heard this music. They were having a party.
Uh-huh.
So they called the Keyport police,
Yeah.
who went and investigated,
Uh-huh.
figuring it was the kids that were broken into the abandoned house or something,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And the police officer, as he got up to the front porch, right
Uh-huh.
before he went to knock, all the lights, everything went out, all the noise stopped, and they knocked, and there was nobody there. So they called the people who
Yeah.
owned it. They figured
Yeah.
out who owned it and came over, and the police walked through, and it looked like nobody had been in there
It was
in
just
months.
empty.
It was just empty. So like that freaked me out. That was like day one. That freaked me out. And I was living by myself. So a couple months later, I had, you hear weird noise and stuff,
Right,
but it's an
right.
old house. And I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. Well,
Uh-huh.
in the dining room, or the room that I had converted to dining room, it's all wooden floors. So
Right.
there were holes in the floor,
Right.
okay, around where I guess they had run wires or whatever. And the light in the basement was on. And it was like all the holes you see, all the lights like a movie. So
Yeah.
I'm a tough guy, so I
Yeah.
ran back in bed and pulled the covers over,
Right.
and I basically held it for like 8
Wait,
hours.
okay, so the light in the basement.
The light in the basement was on.
Okay.
So I get up the next morning,
Yeah.
and I finally go, because I had never been in the basement, because I
Uh-huh.
don't want to go in the basement.
Right.
I went down there, and the light was off. But then I had a buddy who came over, and we had a few beers, so George's like, let's go down there.
Right, of course.
So we did. And it's this huge basement, ran the whole length of the house,
Yeah.
and then there was a room with like big wooden doors. So we opened the doors, and there was an iron slab on the ground,
Uh-huh.
what it looked like it had been on a chain, and
Uh-huh.
a table next to it.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, I found out later that that's where they would basically do all the bodies and everything. And the chain would pull up the metal, and they would basically drain the bodies right down into the floor, and they would go right into the sewers. Like that's how they used to do it.
And when was this? What you said? 18.
Like the mid 1800s.
Okay,
I mean, it was
okay.
one of the first. I'd gone to the Historical Society
Yeah.
in Keyport and talked to the old lady there, and she said that this was like one of the first houses that was built in Keyport.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was like a 4 or 5 block area that was built, and this was like one of the first buildings that was ever built in town.
Wow.
Yeah. So then one night I wake up, and then that's like a month later. I wake up and I get this weird feeling.
Right.
And I get up and I'm like, I don't know what to do. So I literally walked out of the room, and the relief on the ceiling, it was all plaster, like heavy, collapsed, fell right on the bed. I swear, fell right on the bed and like exploded. Totally freaked me out. So I called my buddy George and I said, I'm coming to your house.
Yeah.
I drove like 5 towns over and I slept on his couch that night. So we went back the next morning, and like the pieces of plaster are like big.
Right.
And
right.
I mean, like if one of those had hit my head,
Right.
I mean, I would have been hurt. So I was freaked out, and so I started looking for another place at that point, because I'm like, all right, it's cool, but enough already.
So did you believe in ghosts before this?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I thought, like, as a little kid, I thought maybe I saw stuff or whatever. But I mean, I hadn't even thought about ghosts in years and years, unless horror movies or books or something like that. It wasn't like, and it was like no big deal. I was a skeptic up until about that, all this weird stuff started happening. So then I had I had moved in a roommate, and I ended up giving her that room.
Did you warn her?
Yeah, and she knew, and she was like, "Oh, this is cool," and I'm like, "No, it's in theory it's cool, but once you live this, it's not cool."
Right.
And her brother had come, who was 16 years old, Noah, who had come from Texas to visit, and he spent a week with us, and he wanted a radio or something. Well, I was at work, and I came home. And I said, where'd he get that radio? And she's like, oh, he went down in the basement and got it. And I was joking around, and this is all true.
Yeah.
I said, what did you go in the basement for? She said, like, Satan lives in the basement, and I was like freaked out. But I was like, don't go down in the basement, because I always got a bad feeling.
Right.
The couple of times I had gone down there. And so that night we were hanging out, and we were, I don't know what we were doing. We were hanging out doing something, and he was playing video games like all weekend, and I just let him play. I had PlayStation, and he was playing. So he says, well, I'm going to go to bed. He was like, I got a headache, I'm going to bed. So he lays on the couch, and all of a sudden we start hearing like grunting noises. Like, this is like 10 minutes later.
Right.
So we had the big sliding door, so I'm literally like, he's like 5 rooms away, so I'm opening doors to get to him.
Right.
And he's on the couch, and he's like just flipping out, and I'm like, what's going on? He starts foaming at the mouth.
Are you kidding?
So he has a brain aneurysm on the couch. I mean, and like,
and that was,
we threw that couch out the next day. And so we called the police, and basically by the time he got to the hospital, he was brain dead, and they kept him on life support so his parents could fly in from Texas and stuff. And I just did not, the next day, I did not want to go back to the house. I got such a horrible, even worse feeling than I had.
Right.
And about 2 months later, I finally got another place, and half the stuff that I owned, I had left in the house. I was just in such a rush. Like, you'd see like the Amityville horror movies, and they're like, oh, they left everything. I'm like, why would you do that? And I'm like, I understand. Like, I literally grabbed everything I could grab in my room and threw it. And I filled my car and then just left, and then called the landlord and said, if you could do me a favor. Of course, he was a jerk.
Right.
And actually, I'd paid for the next month, and he changed the locks and everything. But it was like, it just totally freaked me out. Like, and then years later, when I went back, about 10 years ago, I went back for a buddy's wedding, and I went by the house again, and it just, like, I got such a chill, and it was like sunny and nice out, and I just got such a chill just even being on the block anymore, like looking at the house. It was like, and no one has, as far as I know, no one has lived there since.
So there was no one before.
There was no one before for a bunch of years, and then there was nobody after, and I'm trying to think, I had been out there at least 4 or 5 years at that point, and nobody had moved back in, and the guy whose band it was, I ended up talking to him, and he said nobody would, and of course I told everybody, which didn't help them to try to rent the place out, because everybody in town knew what had happened. But it just was really like, I'm like just freaked out just even thinking about it now.
Wow. Well, you heard it here from Armand Rosamilia. This is a great, awesome story, and kind of freaky too.
Except for the dead person.
Except the dead part was not so great. That's true. That was pretty tough. Okay, I'm glad you reminded me.
In case somebody from the family's watching this.
Right. Exactly.